Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Today we're ready for the second part in our historical series, looking at the people of the steppe from antiquity, the Cimmerians and Scythians. I'm your host, Calvinist Klein, a.k.a. Romans 918. And these peoples are a very interesting group to study. Let's get into it.
A reading of the Wikipedia articles about the ancient Cimmerian and Scythian peoples. Text is available under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. Our thanks to the contributors and authors at Wikipedia for the use of this article. The Scythians. The Scythians, also known as the Scythians, Scyth, Saka, Sakai, Ischusei, or Askusei, were a nomadic people who dominated the Pontic steppe from about the 7th century BC up until the 3rd century BC. They were part of the wider Scythian cultures, stretching across the Eurasian steppe, which included many peoples that are distinguished from the Scythians. Because of this, a broad concept referring to all early Eurasian nomads as Scythians has sometimes been used. Within this concept, the actual Scythians are variously referred to as Classical Scythians, European Scythians, Pontic Scythians, or Western Scythians. Use of the term Scythians for all early Eurasian nomads has, however, led to much confusion in literature, and the validity of such terminology is controversial. Other names for that concept are therefore preferable.
The Scythians are generally believed to have been of Iranian origin. They spoke a language of the Scythian branch of the Eastern Iranian languages, and practiced a variant of ancient Iranian religion. Among the earliest peoples to master mounted warfare, the Scythians replaced the Cimmerians as the dominant power on the Pontic steppe in the 8th century BC. During this time they, and related peoples, came to dominate the entire Eurasian steppe, from the Carpathian Mountains in the west, to Ordos Plateau, in the east, creating what has been called the First Central Asian Nomadic Empire. Based in what is modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, the Scythians were led by a nomadic warrior aristocracy, known as the Royal Scythians, who called themselves Scyloti.
In the 7th century BC, the Scythians crossed the Caucasus, and frequently raided the Middle East, along with the Cimmerians, playing an important role in the political developments of the region. Around 650 BC, Scythians briefly dominated the Medes of the western Iranian plateau, stretching their power to the borders of Egypt. After losing control over Media, the Scythians continued intervening in Middle Eastern affairs, playing a leading role in the destruction of the Assyrian Empire, in the sack of Nineveh, in 612 BC. The Scythians subsequently engaged in frequent conflicts with the Achaemenid Empire. The Scythians suffered a major defeat against Macedonia in the 4th century BC, and were subsequently gradually conquered by the Sarmatians, a related Iranian people living to their east. In the late 2nd century BC, their capital at Scythian Neapolis, in the Crimea, was captured by Mithridates VI, and their territories incorporated into the Bosporan kingdom. By this time they had been largely Hellenized. By the 3rd century AD, the Sarmatians, and last remnants of the Scythians, were dominated by the Alans, and were being overwhelmed by the Goths. By the early Middle Ages, the Scythians, and the Sarmatians, had been largely assimilated and absorbed by early Slavs. The Scythians were instrumental in the ethnogenesis of the Ossetians, who are believed to be descended from the Alans.
The Scythians played an important part in the Silk Road, a vast trade network connecting ancient Greece, Persia, India, and China, perhaps contributing to the contemporary flourishing of those civilizations. Settled metalworkers made portable decorative objects for the Scythians. These objects survive mainly in metal, forming a distinctive Scythian art. The name of the Scythians survived in the region of Scythia. Early authors continue to use the term Scythian, applying it to many groups unrelated to the original Scythians, such as Huns, Goths, Turks, Avars, Khazars, and other unnamed nomads. The scientific study of the Scythians is called Scythology.
The Scythians share several cultural similarities with other populations living to their east, in particular, similar weapons, horse gear, and Scythian art, which has been referred to as the Scythian Triad. Cultures sharing these characteristics have often been referred to as Scythian cultures, and its peoples called Scythians. Peoples associated with Scythian cultures include not only the Scythians themselves, who were a distinct ethnic group, but also Cimmerians, Massagetsi, Saka, Sarmatians, and various obscure peoples of the forest steppe, such as early Slavs, Balts, and Finno-Ugric peoples. Within this broad definition of the term Scythian, the actual Scythians have often been distinguished from other groups through the terms Classical Scythians, Western Scythians, European Scythians, or Pontic Scythians.
Origins. Herodotus presented 4 different versions of Scythian origins. Firstly, the Scythians' legend about themselves, which portrays the first Scythian king, Targetus, as the child of the sky god and of a daughter of the Dnieper. Targetus allegedly lived 1,000 years before the failed Persian invasion of Scythia, or around 1500 BC. He had 3 sons, before whom fell from the sky a set of 4 golden implements, a plough, a yoke, a cup, and a battle axe. Only the youngest son succeeded in touching the golden implements, without them bursting with fire, and the son's descendants, called by Herodotus the royal Scythians, continued to guard them. Secondly, a legend told by the Pontic Greeks featuring Scythes, the first king of the Scythians, as a child of Hercules and Echidna. Thirdly, in the version which Herodotus said he believed most, the Scythians came from a more southern part of Central Asia, until a war with the Massagetsi, a powerful tribe of steppe nomads who lived just northeast of Persia, forced them westward. Finally, a legend which Herodotus attributed to the Greek bard Aristes, who claimed to have got himself into such a bacchanalian fury, that he ran all the way northeast across Scythia, and further. According to this, the Scythians originally lived south of the Ripaean Mountains, until they got into a conflict with a tribe called the Isodones, pressed in their turn by the one-eyed Arimaspians, and so the Scythians decided to migrate westwards. Accounts by Herodotus of Scythian origins has been discounted recently, although his accounts of Scythian raiding activities, contemporary to his writings, have been deemed more reliable.
Modern interpretation of historical, archaeological, and anthropological evidence has proposed 2 broad hypotheses on Scythian origins. The first hypothesis, formerly more espoused by Soviet and then Russian researchers, roughly followed Herodotus' third account, holding that the Scythians were an Eastern Iranian-speaking group who arrived from Inner Asia. That is, from the area of Turkestan and western Siberia. The second hypothesis, according to Roman Gershman and others, proposes that the Scythian cultural complex emerged from local groups of the Srubna culture at the Black Sea coast, although this is also associated with the Cimmerians. According to Pavel Delukhanov, this proposal is supported by anthropological evidence, which has found that Scythian skulls are similar to preceding findings from the Srubna culture, and distinct from those of the Central Asian Saka. Yet, according to J.P. Mallory, the archaeological evidence is poor, and the Andronova culture, and at least the eastern outliers of the Timber Grave culture, may be identified as Indo-Iranian.
In 2017, a genetic study of the Scythians suggested that the Scythians were ultimately descended from the Yamna culture and emerged from the Pontic steppe, independently of peoples belonging to Scythian cultures further east. Based on the analysis of mitochondrial lineages, another later 2017 study suggested that the Scythians were directly descended from the Srubna culture. A later analysis of paternal lineages, published in 2018, found significant genetic differences between the Srubna and the Scythians, suggesting that the Srubna and the Scythians instead traced a common origin in the Yamnaya culture with the Scythians and related peoples, such as the Sarmatians, perhaps tracing their origin to the eastern Pontic Caspian steppes and the southern Urals. Another 2019 study also concluded that migrations must have played a part in the emergence of the Scythians as the dominant power of the Pontic steppe.
History. In the early 7th century BC, the Scythians and Cimmerians are recorded in Assyrian texts as having conquered Urartu, In 670, the Scythians under their king Bartachua raided the territories of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian king, Esarhaddon, managed to make peace with the Scythians by paying a large amount of tribute. Bartachua was succeeded by his son Medius around 645 BC, after which they launched a great raid on Palestine and Egypt. Medius subsequently subjugated the Median Empire. During this time, Herodotus notes that the Scythians raided and exacted tribute from the whole of Asia. In 620, Cyaxares, leader of the Medes, treacherously killed a large number of Scythian chieftains at a feast. The Scythians were subsequently driven back to the steppe. In 612 BC, the Medes and Scythians participated in the destruction of the Assyrian Empire with the Battle of Nineveh. During this period of influence in the Middle East, the Scythians became heavily influenced by the local civilizations.
In the 6th century BC, the Greeks had begun establishing settlements along the coasts and rivers of the Pontic steppe, coming in contact with the Scythians. Relations between the Greeks and the Scythians appear to have been peaceful, with the Scythians being substantially influenced by the Greeks, although the city of the Panticapaium might have been destroyed by the Scythians in the mid-century BC. During this time, the Scythian philosopher Anachasis traveled to Athens, where he made a great impression on the local people with his barbarian wisdom.
And so we have it. Another episode focusing on the history of the Cimmerians and their later Scythians, the barbarians of the north. These nomadic horse peoples were a major factor in the history of antiquity in the Middle East, affecting what is today modern Iraq and Iran, or the Persian lands, as well as affecting the Greek-speaking world and Asia Minor, or Turkey, Anatolia. And so these groups of warriors were often seen as a counterbalance. So you had the Greeks on one side and the Medes or Persians on another side, and who would be dominant? Well, it might depend in large part where the Scythians would fall. And so the Greeks, it seemed, often saw the Scythians as potential allies in their wars in antiquity against the Persian empires. And yet, of course, ethnically and racially, it seems that the Scythians were themselves originally an Iranian Persian people. And so they lived in the nomadic steppes of the north, separated from the Persians by the Caspian Sea and Caucasus Mountains, separated from Turkey by the Black Sea, and separated from the Greeks by the Thracian region. What an interesting people group. One is reminded of the warriors of Tolkien's Rohan kingdom, the horse lords of Theoden in the Lord of the Rings saga. And yet, while Tolkien imagined the Rohirrim as a Nordic or Scandinavian type of peoples, It's perhaps better to think of these nomadic Scythian steppes, peoples of the steppe, as being more representative of those rolling hills where the horse lords lived. Until next time, this is Romans 9:18.